3 days had passed, and the day started with Rona's loud wailing. Rona was crying and holding Carl's head. She tells Knox that Carl was dead. Knox stares at them knowing that Rona was crying because Carl had left the world. He recalls the past memories of Rona taking extremely good care of Carl and had put in a lot of effort over the past 3 days. Knox felt bad for her, but he had already knew that something like this would happen. And that Carl couldn't be saved. Poor horsey guys. Knox then tells Rona to stop crying as it was distracting him, but Rona was still concerned about Carl. He tells her not to worry as Carl would soon return to his side again. Rona looked at him after hearing those words and wondered if something was wrong with his head. Feeling annoyed by her reply, Knox tells her to get behind him now. He takes out a scroll from his jacket, and Rona was curious about the scroll. He unrolls the scroll and it showed a summoning circle on it as he places it down. Knox began to cast a spell thinking to infuse his mana into his scroll. Rona was shocked to witness what was happening as the spell was coming to completion. Knox showed a smile as a sweat drop appears on his face once the spell began to die down. Rona approached Knox with caution asking why he knew how to use mana as it was illegal, but Knox was too tired to reply and thought about how he couldn't control his mana well. He decides to go for another round. He tells Rona to stop distracting him as it will make Carl die a second time, and that this time it would be her fault. Rona covered her mouth to stop herself from distracting Knox, while he was trying his best to focus on the spell. He continues to cast the spell thinking that he needed to focus and that he was still someone that hasn't awakened their trait of genius of mana detection. Knox recalls the law about using mana under the age of 15, which was not allowed unless you were from the imperial family. This made it possible for the descendants of the imperial family to be several times more proficient at magic compared to other students who were learning to control mana later. Knox steadies his mind thinking that the only thing he could do right now was to pour as much mana as he could into the scroll. The scroll begins to emit purple flames which Knox could feel its energy from his palms. He realizes that this was mana. He smirks and thinks about how interesting it would be to use his one-time use skill confirmation vouchers. Staring at his hand with purple's flames below it, Knox knew that he mustn't make any mistakes because of the magic that he will be using from now. A window appears saying that the skill book of the dead Necromicron, which was a one-time use object, had been obtained. Knox was using black magic now. A skeleton hand holding onto the book appears with a glowing purple aura. A window appears stating that the target Carl can be revived as an undead. The window asks Knox if he would like to use the magic. Within the game Lunatic, there are 2 types of beings that possess the trait of an undead. The first type are beings that are brought back to life with black magic or dark mana. The second type were those that are brought back to life without an ego and are reborn as a stronger being. Quick question for the viewers: which one would you choose? The first or second type? Comment down below. Knox thinks that those types of beings would remain blindly loyal towards its master, almost to a fault. But the problem was that there was only one family that revives corpses as undead, and that would be the Dark family, Marva's family. While Reinharber is also a dark family, it is mainly a night family, but the Marva's family is a family of black mages that control the undead. In that case, shouldn't players that don't belong to the Marva's family not be able to use their skills at all? Knox thinks. But because of the one-time voucher he had gotten a Necromicron, which was also known as the Book of the Dead, causing Knox to smile. He then soon notices clawed hands appearing from the scroll of summoning. The hands began to surround the body of Carl and were reaching towards it. The hands soon began to cover the entire body of Carl into its darkness. Blood then dripped from Knox's mouth. Rona calls out to him, but he tells her to be quiet, ignoring the blood that's on his face. He focuses on the spell for just a little bit more, but it begins to wreak havoc all over. Knox begins to cough out blood. He looks at his hands and sees that his mana was running out and curses at it. But then he looks up and sees that Carl was now standing up from the dead. Carl roars out loud as its body had changed. Knox looks at Carl just as a window pops up informing him that he had activated the skill successfully. The window states that his pet Carl has been revived as an undead. The eyes of Carl shined bright like a diamond. and Knox was happy to see that the spell worked and that Carl was back from the dead. Rona calls out to Knox in concern, so he stood up. Wiping the blood off his face, Knox calls out to Carl. Carl then approaches Knox and bows its head towards him. Windows appear everywhere showing Carl's traits and information. They were the same as before except he had gotten a negative trait, which states that Carl will be growing at 1.5 times the normal rate, and it would be possible for him to unsummon and summon Carl depending on the mana of the player. Seeing these windows made Knox realize that he had succeeded. Knox touches the head of Carl and telling Carl that he will be his master from now on. Just as Knox was thinking, something interrupted him, which Carl also notices. Rona had rushed in between the both of them and went to hug them, catching the both of them off guard. Knox sees this and asks Rona what she was doing. But Rona was busy crying too much to hear his words. After calming down a bit, she complained to Knox that he had used too much mana and that she thought something had happened to him. She also scolds Carl for being too reckless. But Carl ignores her words and faces away from her. This shocks and angers Rona as she yells at him, telling him that she had cared for him so much. She tells Carl to spit out the carrot she gave him, but Carl just snorts at her. Knox smiles seeing them having fun. He then thinks about what the next hidden piece would be up next. A few days later, Knox is seen walking around the estate at night, and was inside the barn. He exits the barn, and took out a shiny object and a piece of paper. Knox thinks to himself that the road wasn't much different when compared to the game. He places the paper back into his bag, thinking that it was a relief. The second hidden piece of the Reinharber family was an item that he must obtain, as it was a key that will help a little in compensating for the terminally ill trait. But then noises are heard from the bushes, which Knox hears. Knox turns to see what it was, but thought that he was being too sensitive. A wooden sign is seen as Knox continued on his adventure. He thinks to himself that this was no longer a game but reality for him. The sign states that it was Mia's forest and that young children that enter may get lost and die. Just as Knox thinks about not wanting to die a second time, a window appears stating that Knox had entered the missing child forest. The name has changed from Mia's forest. Another window appears saying that failure to clear this palace will result in death. The missing child's forest was a forest that was within the Reinharber's territory, where entry was prohibited, because of the darkness and fog. No matter how skilled a ranger or pathfinder is, they will still have trouble finding their way around. Knox thinks about the name of the forest, as it was a place that causes everyone to get lost like a child. But there was also a different meaning behind its name. If a full-grown adult were to kill a monster, they won't be able to get any artifacts. Knox shudders at the thought that he had died here a few times in order to find the right way to clear it, as the difficulty of the monster would go up if they were an adult. Which was why the difficulty of the missing child forest was at least 2.5 stars, said Knox, while thinking that this was a game where the difficulty is the worst. As he walks through the forest, Knox thinks about how he had played this game really hard to clear it without knowing what items would appear, but now that he thinks about it, this was the perfect item for the terminally ill trait. He soon stops in his track to pull out a torch. He lights the torch up. The flames of the torch shined bright like a diamond in Knox's hand. Its light was paving a way forward for Knox. Knox lets the wind carry the torch smoke, as the torch was a crucial key in clearing the missing child's forest, because of the direction of the smoke. But Knox smirks, as the true key was to go in the opposite direction of the smoke. Before Knox moves on, he closes his eyes and grabs onto the sword. He turns around and speaks out loud, saying, "How long do you intend to hide? How about revealing yourself now?" But no one replies to him in the forest. Knox lets out a sigh, saying, "Hiding until the end, huh?" He grips his sword tightly and swings it towards a pile of bushes, which lets out a scream. "I can't believe that my beauty didn't work on him," said a voice looking in the mirror. It belonged to Talia, who couldn't understand it at all, but a voice calls out to her saying, "Young miss." It belonged to her servant Emma, who was begging her to stop following Knox around. She tells Talia that if she continues, she will be scolded. But Talia assures her that she won't allow her to be fired from the family, but Emma said that wasn't the point. As Emma walked through the hallways carrying a lit candle, She thought about how Talia was talented enough for people to respect her as the next matriarch, only if Chell wasn't around. Emma lets out a sigh as she wonders why Talia felt inferior to her own sister and was being so impatient. She soon reaches a door and thinks that Talia probably gave up on stalking Knox and was now sleeping. She enters the room and looks around. But fear took over her as she couldn't find Talia in the room. Her hand was trembling as she thinks about Talia going out to find Knox. She then wakes everyone up in the building. Talia was then revealed to be the one in the bushes with a dagger on her leg. Knox was stunned to see that it was Talia in the bushes. Talia then greets Knox, but he asks her what she was doing here. She hesitates to answer back at him, but then Knox notices something. He tells her to get behind him as he points the torch forward. A clawed paw and a tail was then seen. It belonged to a gray wolf. Talia began to grow nervous as she didn't expect to be in Grey Wolf's territory in the forest and that she only had a dagger with her right now. The Grey Wolf began to circle Knox and Talia. Its eyes were focused on them with evil. But then it raises its head up into the air and lets out a fierce howl into the air which startles Knox and Talia. As the light of the moon shined into the forest, the Grey Wolf lunges towards Knox and Talia with its fangs showing. But Knox was smiling at this, while Talia was nervous. She was surprised to see Knox rushing forward. Knox uses the torch to land a hit on the Grey Wolf as it pounces towards them, and soon slices the neck of the Grey Wolf. It falls to the ground, startling Talia. She thought about how incredible it was for Knox to defeat it so cleanly. But something catches her eye. Knox turns around to see her as his face was covered with blood. He then questions Talia about why she was following him, as he had thought that it was his brothers that were following him. Talon twirls her hair and stutters, saying she was out on a night walk. Knox goes to grab his torch, saying not to bullshit him, otherwise he would leave her here alone. Ah, said Talia upon hearing those words. She grabs onto Knox's wrist, which surprises him. She then explains in a mad flurry that she caught him sneaking out while thinking about how to be as strong as him, and that if she followed him she could find out his secret training method, and that was why she followed him into the forest. Knox smiles and thinks about being certain about three things. The first thing was that Talia thinks immensely highly of Knox, the second was that she was not hostile towards him, and lastly that she was a kid that knows nothing about how dangerous it was to follow others late at night. Knowing that she was one of the core characters, Knox couldn't leave her here alone. He then tells her to follow him for now. As he begins to walk, Knox tells her that he wanted to make something clear. Knox turns to her and tells her that he was not trying to help her, but was just trying to resolve the wolf situation so his family doesn't get put in a bad spot. Talia blushes and says she was sorry and that she was in the wrong this time. Knox looks at her and thinks that she probably won't do anything dangerous again. But then Talia begins to call out to Knox and tells him thanks while blushing as the leaves flow around them. Knox was surprised to hear those words from her. Talia then begins to say something else, but was shocked to see something. A pack of gray wolves had appeared from the shadows. Talia calls out Knox's name as he stood there with his lit torch, showing that they were up against a whole lot of gray wolves. Talia was trembling in fear as she holds onto Knox's arm tightly. But he tells her to get away from her, which surprises Talia. Knox stands in front of her and tells her that she will be in his way when he swings his sword. He begins thinking about how there were some unexpected variables and that he needed to focus again. He stares at the gray wolves, knowing that this was the place before the scenario starts, and that since it's an area within the prologue, there won't be any boss monsters. But an elite monster one rank below the boss monster will appear, the evolved form of the gray wolf he had just cut down, called the elite gray wolf. The gray wolves that were circling around Talia and Knox began to move and dash towards them. Just as Knox thinks about knowing who his enemy is, doesn't mean that things would go smoothly for him. He slices the two gray wolves closest to him. As the wolves continue to attack him, a single wolf was standing behind its pack and watching the battle unfold, as Knox thought to himself that there were times when one ought to realize that it's possible they've been driven into a corner. Knox notices something was headed to him, and he sees that a gray wolf had leaped towards him in the air. He continues to think that he'll repeat what he always said in times like this, just like when he was Yoo Chan and player inner Lunatic. He prepares his blade for his next attack. And with a major swing of his blade it lands a hit onto the Grey Wolf, as he thought of himself as a FING weakling. Knox finally relaxes and lets out a deep breath. Talia, who was holding onto the torch, was amazed at Knox, and that he hasn't even revealed his full power yet, with his sword technique being even more amazing when he was fighting his brothers. She stares at the dead Grey Wolves and wondered if Knox had ever killed Grey Wolves before. Talia grips the torch tightly, thinking that Knox still thought of her as being weak. But something was happening in the forest that caught both of their attention. Knox looks up and noted that it was finally here. Elite Grey Wolves had appeared in front of them. Back at the barn on the estate, the servants were calling out to Talia and asking for more tortures. 2 tracks of small footsteps are found marked on the ground where a servant deduces that they belonged to the Knox and Talia's footprints. The servant told the others that he believed that the both of them had entered the missing child's forest. Emma collapses upon hearing that they went into the forest. She turns around to ask what they should do, telling the others that they needed to go into the forest immediately. But Rodwell tells her not to be foolish, as going into the forest was impossible. Emma shouts at him, wondering why they couldn't go in. It was because the forest was something that even the Reinharber family had managed to clear. The missing child's forest was ranked one of the highest within the Reinharber family. While the Reinharber family is known to be the strongest dark family in the South, the fact that there's still a forest that they aren't able to clear is basically like saying that they were incompetent. But there was the fact that only children who haven't become adults can enter the forest. And that the forest can only be cleared successfully by children hasn't made known to them yet. Rodwell thinks hard about why Knox would enter the forest. He looks at the footprints and didn't think that Knox was bewitched by a mind-controlling monster, and based on the tracks Knox had moved with care. There were also no traces of anyone getting past the strongest mana barrier of the estate too. Rodwell looks up into the sky, and with all the facts that he had gathered, he realized that Knox had intentionally went into the forest. He grips his fist tightly, and knew that he could no longer see Knox as the weak and frail young master from before. Rodwell then begins to speak, telling the others that there was only one way for the both of them to return. He tells them that Knox has to use his wisdom to find their way out of the forest. Emma, tears and sweat began to come out upon hearing Rodwell's words. The servants continued to search around the area with their lit torches. But Emma was still feeling terrified as tears flow from her face. She believes that she was the one who had caused Talia to die. Talia grabs the dagger off of her leg and prepares to fight back against the monsters. Knox looks back at her and tells her to not attack unnecessarily, as she might get hurt, so she just needs to stay out of the fight, while thinking that she hasn't lost concentration despite being scared. He continues to advise her to save her strength and to run away if she were to be attacked, only then could she raise her rate of survival a little higher. Looking at the elite Grey Wolves, Knox thinks that killing one wouldn't be that dangerous since it had only a 2.5 rating. But all he wanted right now was for Talia to remain vigilant and to be able to react to her surroundings. Knox continues to look at her, noticing that she had learnt well, but not yet at a level where he could trust her with his back. He looks forward and started to prepare his attack. He activates the skill hour of the genius, thinking that by using this skill he could kill it in one go. But the elite Grey Wolf was smiling for some reason, which both Knox and Talia were surprised by. The pack of elite Grey Wolves seemed to be making fun of the two of them. Knox soon became annoyed as he realized what the Grey Wolves were doing. But all of a sudden, one of the Grey Wolves began to dash towards him. Knox easily lands a blow onto the Grey Wolf, causing the other Grey Wolves to stop in their tracks. But Knox was weary of why they stopped attacking together. The elite Grey Wolf was seen just laying on the floor with a calm expression on its face. The Grey Wolves then began another round of attacks by coming at Knox from all sides. Knox manages to slice one of the wolves with ease once again. But another Grey Wolf appears behind him. It lets out a fierce roar that captures Knox's attention. Before Knox could react, a dagger was sent flying straight into the Grey Wolf's body, killing it. Knox looks to where the dagger had come from and sees Talia in the trees, who tells him to be careful. Talia thinks about the fact that Knox had told her to run away once it got dangerous. But with a determined face, Talia didn't want to do that. Knox's feelings towards Talia began to change, as he wonders if she was going to help him. Thanks for watching the latest part from the voice of Manhwa. Subscribe for more content and don't forget to comment below what you want to see in the future. Like and share for more Manhwa recaps in the